Hi, people. Hope you're all well. Recently I've noticed that there has been a collective response by a certain segment of the political left to the usage of the term wokeism. When I say recently, that's loosely speaking. I'm not talking about any start point, just recent years. Um, Woke itself, the idea of wokeism, has really galvanized in as vernacular, it's really galvanized in the last, I would say, roughly decade, but specifically the late 2010s onwards. But the origins of the term didn't originate in the late 2010s. Now, I've drawn attention to this before, but I think it's very important to reiterate. Why? Because the response from this segment of the left has very much been that basically wokeism is an invented right wing smear. I saw this absurd tweet the other day. It had been reposted on Facebook, so it was like a screenshot of a tweet. And basically, it was something along the lines of what they call woke, we call being compassionate and considering people. That's absurd. That is a distortion because that's not what woke is. This is very important to look at, but I'm coming at this from a point of view of someone who associates with the political centre. My username is Centrist Philosopher. As I've said before, the philosopher bit's a bit tongue in cheek. It's a bit cheeky. I'm not a philosopher. It's just sounds good, right? Centrist. That bit's more candid because I do see myself as a centrist. The thing about centrism, it's not sort of set in stone. It's not. There's no particular definition of centrism. There's no that's a centrist viewpoint. That's a centrist viewpoint. It's more like, how would I describe it? It's a way of looking at things as not so black and white, without necessarily, without, I would say, portraying conviction or not having strong views, because people who align with the centre are not sitting on the fence. This is a very important point. It's not sitting on the fence. It's not sort of saying, "Oh well, you both have a good point of view. I agree with you, and I agree with you. Let's all get on with each other. Let's be neutral." That's not the centrist position, and I don't think it ever has been. There will be people, of course, who feel it's most diplomatic to sit on the fence, and we can even look at this in terms of nation states. India's controversial stance on the Ukraine war, for example. They don't support Russia, but they certainly haven't condemned Russia either. But that doesn't mean India is centrist. It means that India is sitting on the fence with this, in my opinion. And I think it's a failure, but that's by the by. That's in terms of geopolitics. No, when we're talking about people, centrism often comes down to not being able to pigeonhole people so easily as typically left or typically right. So someone who is typically right may be, um, just as an example perhaps to use an American example, they may be very, very pro Second Amendment, they may be anti abortion, they may be quite an evangelical Christian, um, they may be very critical of some of the direction left wing academics are going in. That may be a typical conservative. They may favour the small state. Those are all positions that can be associated with conservatives. Um, and then a typical left-leaning person may be very big on what they see as social justice issues. Um, they may be. I mentioned the gun issue. I don't actually think that's necessarily left and right. I think there's moderate conservatives who do support common sense gun control. But this is very, very loose, okay? Um, So yeah, a typical left-leaning person may be very big on social justice issues. They may favor, for example, critical race theory and teaching critical race theory. They may be very big on sort of the West introspecting on its past in a way that the right maybe not so much. These are very, very loose definitions, okay? But when someone associates with quite a number of positions, well, that's a left-wing person may also be a self-described feminist, anti-racist, and so on. Very loosely speaking, very loosely speaking. Um, so a centrist may not be that easy to pin down. Example, you may have, um, let's say, I don't know, someone who believes in critical race theory, but is also very pro Second Amendment. How do you pin them down? It's, I know it's not very common, but you may have that situation. You may have a woman who's very outspoken, a very outspoken feminist, but she's actually quite conservative on immigration, something like that. So you will get people who are not that easy to pin down. Um, and perhaps they would veer towards the centrist way of looking at things. I mean, how do I define my centrism? I define my centrism as when I look at every issue, some issues I do veer to the right, some issues I veer to the left, and ultimately, if I was to average it out, it would come to the centre. But that doesn't mean I'm neutral on every issue. I've got very strong views on a lot of issues. On the issue of crime, for example, this is something that would be much more associated with conservatives. I'm hardline. I think if you hurt society, you belong behind bars if it's that sort of crime. I'm very hardline and very outspoken on the likes of just stop oil. And sometimes, certain movements and the way things are going can actually shape someone's outlook on sociopolitics. So I must admit, I have become more critical of the Green movement as a whole. Why? Because if we look at groups like Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion and so on, they're basically, I mean, it's easy to dismiss them as fringe elements, but they are endorsed and promoted by the likes of Greenpeace, which is more established, more mainstream. So that says a lot to me about the wider green movement that they are endorsing these more extreme elements. Um, and it has made me a bit more skeptical of the green movement, not necessarily of, for example, climate change is influenced by human activity. I don't go with the right on that. But what I'm saying is that the way things unfold can also shape our viewpoints on things. So it's all very well saying I'm someone with conviction. That's a good thing, but events do change. To use a political term, real politic. If a leader changes his or her position, and it's a good change, it's denounced as a U-turn. But sometimes a political U-turn is a good thing. It shouldn't always be seen as a negative thing. Sometimes if it's changing because of public demand, if it's changing because circumstances change, that may be justified. Now, if it's changing just for populist reasons, that's cynical. So, having said all that, with my outlook on centrism, I want to lay out a centrist's look at the woke left because, again, this is something that often people who criticize wokeism, there's this reactionary attitude. Well, you must be a right winger, you must be a conservative, you must be a triggered right winger, and they'll reverse the language. I think the left to promote wokeism, and I'm very careful how I say this because I do not believe it's the left as a whole. I don't believe that. I know people who are definitely would be on the political left on many issues. For example, they might vote for the Labour Party. Um, they might hold left-wing views on a wide number of issues, but they too do not like wokeism and the way it's going, and they see why it's problematic. So if we look at wokeism as a sort of idea that's developed in the late 2010s, where does that come from? It comes from older thinking. In the 1970s, particularly African Americans, particularly those who were on the more, let's say, assertive side of things, more hard line side of things, not necessarily the civil rights marches of the 60s, but perhaps more the Black Power movement of the 70s. Wokeism can be traced to this idea of being awoken to injustice as they saw it, racial injustice. And if we're being honest, there was a lot of things to address at the time. And there still is. but that's where it originates from, being awoken to injustice. Um, and then that in itself apparently has even older origins, going as far back as the 1930s, which I only discovered recently. So we need to be very clear about this. Although woke in current usage is a relatively recent phenomenon, last less than 10 years, it has older origins. So this is not something invented by the right. That is a complete distortion, and it needs to be robustly challenged, because I feel that what's actually happening is, now that it is being exposed for its intolerance and for the many issues that I think are wrong with it, then it's kind of like, oh, but this is a way that the right wants, talk down compassion. That's nonsense, absolute nonsense. Um, in fact, it's interesting. Elon Musk and his highly publicized takeover of Twitter, he posted something recently which showed that there was this group of this collection of T-shirts in Twitter headquarters, literally printed on them "Stay woke," and he's rather cheekily changed this to "Stay at work." But that shows that this is a real ideology. It's not something invented by the right. So that idea needs to be robustly challenged. It is not something invented by the right. I repeat, it is not something invented by the right. And some prominent left wingers keep pushing this. James O'Brien of LBC is one example. He had a whole program dedicated to this. He also debated Piers Morgan. Quite frankly, I have little time for James O'Brien. I think he's quite arrogant. Um, I think there's a certain strategy that he uses. I think sometimes, call this cynical, but I think his people, that is, those who take the phone calls, I know how radio stations work. They will often try to get a call coming in that sounds interesting or it can help ratings. If they get someone who's quite angry and, quite outspoken, they will put that person through, because it gives them an opportunity. LBC, unfortunately, is yet another network that does this. James O'Brien eviscerates right winger, or James O'Brien shuts down right wing caller. To be honest, I think there's a dumbing down of journalism in general. Now, maybe that isn't doing me any favors in terms of potential job prospects, but I do think there's a problem in the wider media industry, and the left and the right are guilty of it. So instead of having just an exchange of ideas, this person believes this person believes that. No, it's so and so shuts down so and so. It's a rather tiresome dumbing down of journalism. Um, and it's very cynical. But anyway, that's an example. So O'Brien, again, I think he's quite a smart guy actually, but he probably knows this, but he puts out, oh well, it's an invented right wing smear. And what they will do, what his producers will do is, or that's probably the wrong word I'm using, the people that will take the calls, they will let in someone who's maybe not the most articulate, who maybe is, ranting a little bit. And then O'Brien, he's a skilled journalist. It doesn't mean he's entirely honest, but he's skilled enough to be able to, make them look foolish. But that doesn't mean he's right. It just means that it's a cynical approach of, well, we'll pick this person who's not the most eloquent, maybe doesn't think things through, but it's cynical because it's very easy for O'Brien to take them down, so to speak. Um, if I was on that show, that particular segment, I would have been very calm, because there's nothing O'Brien likes more than someone losing their temper, because then he can pigeonhole them. I'd say, Mr. O'Brien, where does the term woke originate from? I'd see how he answers that, because the left is fundamentally dishonest about this. Fundamentally, they are dishonest about the origins. So I keep reiterating this: woke was not invented by the right. I'll say it 10 times if I have to, because I think it's a way to try and shut down it's a way to counter the criticism of woke ideology. So let's get into that criticism. And it's a criticism I agree with. It's a criticism that I follow. And this is why I don't call myself woke, and why I'm very wary of people who do. Because I find that they're among the most intolerant people around. So it's a little bit like those feminists who will say, oh, but feminism's just about equality of men and women. You know, when someone is pointing out the hypocrisies of Western third wave feminism, for example, the feminist groups recently who went out of their way to defend Amber Heard, even though she is a known domestic abuser. So it's this kind of thing, well, she's a woman, she must be right. It's a very sexist position to take. Um, so, you know, someone criticizing that, a typical feminist attitude would be, oh, but that's not what feminism means. Feminism's just about equality. It's this go to dictionary definition. Dictionary definitions are all very well, but really, movements will be judged on the positions that its adherents take. So, if Western feminists are taking these sexist sort of positions, then they can't complain about getting a bad image. And to those moderate feminists who don't agree with that, speak up. You know, what I would say to them is they need to call out the sexists in their midst, the anti-male sexist in their midst. I think it's a responsibility of every reasonable person to weigh in on the extremes in their midst. That's why I'm disappointed by the wider environmental movement because I think they have failed to rein in on the extremes. You know, to say this is not the way to do things. You don't get, you know, don't reduce CO2 emissions by polarizing the public. But wokeism, it's an umbrella term because it actually, when I think of wokeism, what I think of is, for example, critical race theory. This idea that every challenge that minority people faced can be put down simply to, well, all the institutions are fundamentally racist. Minority people are held back because they're fundamentally racist. So if a black or an Asian person doesn't get a job, it must be racism. If young black men end up in prison, it must be racism. Um, and the examples can go on. The interesting thing is critical race theory doesn't acknowledge, if it's this idea that people are shaped by inherent discrimination, how does that explain the fact that white working class boys are the most disadvantaged when it comes to education? Something the Prime Minister, Theresa May, acknowledged in her maiden speech as Premier. So, my issue of critical race theory, firstly, it's not consistent, but secondly, what sort of message is it sending out? So, it's saying there's racism, it's institutionalized, and we need to take that on. But the problem is, it's fostering this never-ending grievance culture, whereby any challenge that someone faces in life can just be dismissed as racism, rather than the fact that life is hard for everyone. Life is a challenge. Um, I think it's fundamentally toxic because I don't think it's building bridges. I don't think it's saying, how can we help minority people get ahead? I think what it's saying is, if you're a minority person and you're struggling, blame the white people because they have white privilege, which is a term that's closely associated with critical race theory. And it's a hateful, ugly term, in my opinion. Why? Because it kind of contradicts the woke zone narrative of judging people by their own lived experience. Not when it comes to white people. No, when it comes to white people, they're all the same. It doesn't matter if someone has been perhaps experienced homelessness. I mean, I can say in my city, every rough sleeper I have seen is white. That won't be true in other parts of the country. It'll be more mixed, and that could just be because Sunderland is quite a we're a white majority city. I could say 86% or something like that. But um, the point is, you cannot just take an individual and say this person will be judged by the group that they are part of. It's a fundamentally racist position. In fact, I can't think of anything more racist than saying fundamentally you will be judged on the color of your skin. That is fundamentally what the notion of white privilege does. And they can say, oh, it's not doing that, it's not treating everyone the same. That's exactly what it's doing. That is exactly what it's doing. And it's yet another issue about dishonesty. Because dishonesty is a fundamental part of woke thinking. They're fundamentally dishonest. Now, at this point, I'll just make a quick caveat. I do think there will be some people who call themselves woke, and their heart's in the right place. So they genuinely believe in compassion. They genuinely believe, they're anti-racism, they're anti-sexism, and they genuinely believe this, and they call themselves woke. I would urge those people to look at why woke is being criticized. It's not being criticized because it pertains to be anti-racist. It's not being criticized because it pertains to be anti-prejudice. You know, um, it's being criticized because it's dishonest. It's being criticized because it's not consistent. It's being criticized because it's divisive, and it's being criticized because it adopts bullying tactics. For example, a lecturer who doesn't go along with woke thinking can expect to be hounded out of their job, or at least face significant pressure to be so, to be hounded out of their job. A woke professor, on the other hand, a woke academic, will likely get promotion. I think that something like critical race theory, it's permeated our institutions to a very significant level, and not just universities. We're now seeing this in NHS trusts. I've cited that case of the woman in the London Trust, the Portland Trust, that's the Tavistock and Portland Trust, and they were actually trying to teach her or force her to take this course about examining whiteness and how, basically white people need to introspect and feel ashamed for the color of their skin. That's fundamentally what it comes down to. Now, when I looked at their Facebook page, the Tavistock Portman Trust, they were very big on, they had lots of little rules. You know, any malicious communication will be ignored. And basically, don't criticize us. That's basically what it came down to. So there's this fundamental hypocrisy of we can criticize, we can be critical, we can assess this, but we won't take criticism. Now that's just thin skinned. That's just petty. Um, but it's worse than petty. It's actually very controlling because another thing that you get with woke ideology is getting into this business of language policing. And it starts getting into, well, that's a microaggression. So something as innocent as a person asking another person at a party, oh, where are you from? That's a microaggression if the person happens to be non-white. Now that question could be totally innocent. I think it's one of those things that depends on the tone. So for example, hey, how's it going? Haven't seen you before. Where are you from? Like, where do you call home? Um, that to me would be just a conversation piece. But if it's oh, where are you from? You're not one of us. That would be hostile. So the whole business of microaggressions is very much, I think, is very much tone dependent. And the problem I have with it is it overanalyzes what could be something totally innocent. Now, if someone has given the answer, they say, "Oh, I'm from Leeds," or "I'm from Bristol," and then the person says, "Oh, but where are you really from?" Now that could be quite insulting and quite dismissive. I can understand someone getting annoyed by that. Hell, I could say I've been targeted by microaggressions because I'm from Northern Ireland. For 20 years growing up in England, I've had to hear people saying, "What part of Ireland are you from?" And it's kind of like this constant idea that I've just come from there because I still have the accent. But you know what? I don't run to the police and say I'm a victim of a hate crime because 90% of the time it's it's done in such a way that is really harmless, and I know it's harmless. What is annoying is if I tell them and they still kind of, so for example, I'll say, well, yeah, I'm from Belfast originally, I'm from Northern Ireland, and they say, I went to County Cork once. I think, well, good for you. That's not in Northern Ireland. So I think willful ignorance can certainly be irritating, and it can be stubborn, and it can be, when people are told they should be respectful enough to listen to the other person's answer. But there are actually empirical examples of this sort of stuff in action. the University of Sheffield, at one point, because there had been students, apparently there'd been some racist abuse on campus. Now, the correct way to deal with that, they should have identified the students responsible and disciplined them, either warned them, or depending on how serious the offence was, expel them as individuals. What did the University of Sheffield do? They had this collective program where they literally paid students to monitor each other for microaggressions. This sort of stuff happens all the time. And woke activists would say, oh, the Daily Mail is just making that up. Now, the Daily Mail is certainly a biased paper, as many papers are. I certainly don't like everything that comes out of it. I don't like their fixation on Brexit, for example. But the thing about all newspapers, even tabloids, they have to fundamentally get their information correct. They might be biased, but they can't just outright tell lies, because if they did, legal action could be taken against them, and they don't want the hassle. So, yes, they may be biased, they may cherry pick, but that doesn't mean it's false, doesn't mean it's a lie. And I'm not saying newspapers never lie, but I'm saying that editors know that's a risk to do, because they could then face legal action if they did. Um, so that's important. But again, whenever these things are brought up, left wing woke advocates say it's all exaggerated, it's made up, it didn't really happen. And yet there's empirical evidence that this stuff does happen from more than one source. Another example that can be associated with wokeism is the whole idea of cultural appropriation. I mean, my goodness, you could get into all sorts of things that are associated with this. I'm going to bring this video to the half hour mark. I do think it's important. Cultural appropriation, right? That's another one. So it's this idea that, particularly, again, it's aimed at white people. If a white person enjoys culture um, from another part of the world or another ethnicity, associated with another ethnicity, well, that's wrong. They're culturally appropriating. So let's say, for example, you have a white girl who thinks that a Chinese qipao, the cheongsam, the very elegant silk dress, maybe she thinks that's beautiful. So she wants to wear it for a special occasion. Maybe it's her birthday, maybe it's graduation. This actually happened in the United States about, would have been about 6 years ago now. I made a video about it at the time. And what actually happened in that case was she was denounced for culturally appropriating, as if only Chinese people are allowed to wear that, or people of Asian descent. Now, she wasn't insulting the culture. If anything, she was saying, this is beautiful. I respect the elegance of this. But fundamentally, telling other people what they can wear is wrong. Um, I have a friend of Scots descent. He now lives in Argentina. And he made the interesting point that if you take this cultural appropriation concept to its full, then a lot of things associated with Scots culture would have died out in the 18th and 19th centuries with Highland clearances, which was a concerted and shameful attempt by the Hanoverian dynasty to kind of wipe away Scots culture, particularly Highland culture and clan culture. Um, and it was a dark period of history. But under the idea of cultural appropriation, had Scots culture not been, celebrated in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, around the world, had that not been culturally appropriate, it would have possibly been really vulnerable to being gone. Um, so sometimes cultural appropriation, so called, can actually help to preserve a culture. That's an aspect that's underlooked. Now, I'm not totally blind to the problems of this. If you get people who are adopting the dress of another culture and they're just taking the piss, they're just mocking it, that I can understand why that would be offensive. But simply appreciating another culture, if you want to really get down to it, where do you draw a line? You know, so a Japanese person may say, "Oh, white and black people can't wear a kimono; it's cultural appropriation." But then the tables can be turned and say, "Okay, well, should Japanese people adopt aspects associated with Western culture? Isn't that cultural appropriation that comes from the reforms of the 1850s in Japan?" Isn't that cultural appropriation? So where do you draw a line? Um, what one person calls cultural appropriation, another will say appreciating other cultures. I'm going to wrap this up soon, but I'll conclude with this. I think some of the galvanization of woke ideology is because there are certain responses by the right that are a bit immature. Um, I mean, the term snowflake is something that is invented by the right, and it's not a term I use. And I think it is misplaced. Sometimes, for example, people could be talking about mental health problems. They're not a snowflake. That's a serious issue. Suicide's a serious issue. Um, so I do think there's right wingers that just throw out childish insults. And, they say, oh, you're being woke, but maybe they're just being an ass, right? Maybe they're the ones who need to grow up a little bit. So I don't say that all critics of wokeism are blameless themselves. And I think some of the right wing reactionaries, they will sometimes they'll say something is woke when really it's just a reasonable thing. Talking about mental health isn't woke. Calling on people to be compassionate, that's not woke. um, Trigger warnings, for example, can sometimes be justified if you have someone who's a domestic abuse survivor and maybe there's a production that depicts domestic abuse. Having a disclaimer saying this production depicts domestic abuse, that's not woke. That's just sensitive and respectful because it's letting that person know that that may be triggering to their experience. So I do think sometimes the word is thrown around a little bit, but I think that woke advocates are fundamentally dishonest about how this is used. So, if you think that woke is unfairly criticized, consider the things I've said. Consider how cultural appropriation, critical race theory, and those sort of ideas, how they're weaponized. Look at the hounding of J.K. Rowling. Look at the way academics are badgered and harassed if they don't go along with, for example, decolonizing textbooks. Um, there's a fundamental intolerance with woke thinking, and it's got absolutely nothing to do with being open minded. It's got everything to do with controlling. That's my take. People are welcome to agree or disagree, but that's how I see it. So I am anti woke for those reasons. I am simultaneously all for being anti bullying, being sensitive, being compassionate, opposing all forms of sexism and racism. It's that simple.